Let me ask you something. What if someone you trusted completely stole not just your money, but your entire life savings, your retirement, your children's college fund, everything? And what if they did it using nothing but forged documents and lies told in boardrooms you never saw? This is happening right now in 2026. And the shocking part? The victims don't see it coming until it's too late. Welcome back to the verdict room. I'm your host, and today we're breaking down 5 real estate scams that cost everyday Americans millions of dollars and landed the perpetrators in federal prison. These aren't theoretical crimes. These are cases that went to court, were prosecuted by the Department of Justice, arbitrated by judges, and resulted in verdicts so staggering they might shock you. Let's start with a number that will make your stomach drop. In June 2026, a property owner in Laguna Beach, California, won a $1.34 billion arbitration verdict against the people who defrauded them. $1.34 billion. That's not a lawsuit settlement, that's an arbitration award, meaning a neutral arbitrator reviewed the evidence and determined that fraud occurred. But here's the thing, getting that verdict is only half the battle. Collecting it is another story entirely. So what actually happened in Laguna Beach? Laguna Beach is one of the most exclusive coastal communities in Southern California. The properties there aren't just homes, they're generational wealth. Multi-million-dollar estates with ocean views, architectural significance, and land that increases in value every single year. This makes Laguna Beach a magnet for real estate operators, investors, and unfortunately, fraudsters. In this case, a sophisticated fraud scheme operated for years. Multiple properties were involved, multiple transactions, and the structure of the scheme is what made it so deadly. The fraudsters didn't just steal money once, they used forged documents, false property valuations, and manipulated escrow records to convince legitimate investors and lenders that properties were worth far more than they actually were. Think about what that means legally. Real estate fraud isn't just theft. It's fraud, yes. But it also involves conspiracy, multiple people working together. It involves forgery, creating false documents. It involves wire fraud, using electronic communication systems to carry out the scheme. And it involves potentially violating federal statutes, because when you involve lenders and interstate commerce, it becomes a federal crime. The arbitrator's $1.34 billion verdict represents not just the property value lost, but damages for fraud, emotional distress, loss of investment returns, and punitive damages designed to punish the wrongdoers so severely that others think twice before attempting similar crimes. But Laguna Beach isn't the only major real estate fraud case making headlines in 2026. Around the same time, the SEC, the Securities and Exchange Commission, was building cases against real estate fraud ringleaders in a separate conspiracy. According to The Real Deal, multiple defendants were convicted and sent to federal prison. The SEC charged them not just with property fraud, but with securities fraud, meaning they sold fraudulent investment packages to victims who believed they were buying into legitimate real estate development projects. The mechanism here is chilling in its simplicity. The fraudsters would identify a piece of land or an existing property. They'd create glossy marketing materials. They'd promise investors returns of 15, 20, sometimes 30% annually. They'd claim the property was undervalued, that development was imminent, that the market was about to explode. Then they'd collect millions from investors, and most of that money would never go toward the actual property. It would go into the fraudsters' personal accounts, their houses, their cars, their offshore bank accounts. When the promised returns didn't materialize, investors started asking questions. That's when the real crime deepens. The fraudsters would tell new lies to cover the old ones. They'd show fabricated escrow documents. They'd create false bank statements. They'd hire people to pose as contractors to show fake progress on developments that didn't exist. The SEC's investigation revealed that one sales agent was specifically targeted for enforcement action. This person had sold these fraudulent investment packages to vulnerable investors, often retirees looking for income, middle-class families trying to grow their wealth. The agent knew, or should have known, that the claims being made were false. Under federal securities law, if you sell investment packages to the public, you have a fiduciary duty. That's a legal term that means you must act in the best interest of the person you're selling to. You cannot knowingly sell them fraud. The penalties are severe: federal prison sentences, massive fines, and civil liability. Now, here's what's crucial to understand about how these cases are prosecuted. Real estate fraud operates in layers. On the surface, it might look like a simple property transaction gone wrong. But when prosecutors and civil attorneys dig deeper, they find a web of conspiracy, false documents, and interstate commerce violations. The legal standard for fraud has 4 elements. This is important. Prosecutors and plaintiffs must prove all 4, or the case falls apart. First, the defendant made a false statement or representation. In real estate fraud, this is the forged appraisal, the fake property survey, the fabricated title document. Second, the defendant knew the statement was false when they made it. This is the mens rea, the guilty mind. They knew what they were doing was wrong. Third, the defendant intended for the victim to rely on this false statement. They deliberately marketed it. They deliberately put it in front of the victim. They deliberately made it persuasive. And fourth, the victim actually did rely on that statement and suffered damages as a result. In the Laguna Beach case, the arbitrator found all 4 elements were present. The defendants had made false valuations. They knew those valuations were inflated. They knew victims would rely on them, and the victims lost massive sums of money. But here's where the law gets interesting. In arbitration, the standard of proof is slightly different than in criminal court. In criminal court, the prosecution must prove guilt beyond a reasonable doubt, a very high bar, around 99% certainty. In civil arbitration, the standard is a preponderance of the evidence, meaning more likely than not that fraud occurred, around 51% certainty. This is why the $1.34 billion verdict was issued in arbitration rather than through a criminal conviction, though criminal charges may be forthcoming. So how are these cases actually proven in court? Forensic accountants are crucial. These are specialized investigators who trace money flows. They can look at bank statements, wire transfers, escrow records, and reconstruct exactly where money went. In real estate fraud cases, forensic accountants often discover that funds meant for property acquisition were diverted to personal accounts, or that fictional transactions were recorded in accounting systems. Document examiners are equally critical. Real estate fraud depends on forged documents, false deeds, false property surveys, false appraisals, false title insurance policies. Examiners can determine if signatures were forged, if documents were altered, if appraisals were fabricated by comparing them to legitimate versions. Email and digital forensics play a role too. The fraudsters had to communicate with each other. They sent emails discussing which victims to target, how much to overvalue properties, what fake documents to create. These communications are smoking guns. They show consciousness of guilt. Now, you might be wondering, how do everyday people protect themselves from this? First, understand that legitimate real estate transactions move slowly and transparently. If someone is pressuring you to make a decision quickly, if they're offering returns that seem impossibly high, if they're avoiding putting promises in writing, those are red flags, serious red flags. Second, hire your own attorney. This cannot be overstated. A real estate attorney costs a few $1,000s. Getting defrauded in a real estate deal costs you hundreds of thousands, sometimes millions. The math is simple. Third, verify independently. Don't just accept the seller's property appraisal. Hire your own appraiser. Don't just trust the title company's report. Verify the title history. Don't just accept claims about future development or returns. Research the developer's track record. Check state licensing records. Verify their credentials. Fourth, be skeptical of anyone who has anything to hide. Legitimate developers, legitimate sellers, legitimate investment firms are willing to provide documentation. They're willing to have their claims verified. If someone gets defensive when you ask questions, that's a warning sign. The reason these cases are proliferating in 2026 is that real estate values are so high, and the stakes are so enormous, that the incentive to commit fraud is higher than ever. A property fraudster who steals $50,000 from one investor might steal $1.34 billion from multiple investors over several years. The crimes compound. But here's the encouraging news. Law enforcement is getting better at catching these crimes. The SEC is allocating more resources to real estate fraud investigations. State attorneys general are prosecuting fraudsters aggressively. And courts, when they find that fraud has occurred, are issuing verdicts so massive that they send a clear message. You will lose far more than you gain. The Laguna Beach verdict, the SEC prosecutions, the federal prison sentences. These are the consequences. And unlike many court cases that take years to resolve, real estate fraud prosecutions are moving faster in 2026 because the evidence is often digital, documented, and clear. Here's what I want you to understand at the deepest level. Real estate fraud isn't a victimless crime. It doesn't just cost wealthy investors money, it destroys lives. Retirees who thought their nest egg was secure discover they've lost everything. Families who were promised a better future watch those dreams collapse. Small investors who pooled their resources with others discover they've been betrayed by someone they trusted. The legal system's response, through arbitration, through SEC enforcement, through criminal prosecution, is designed to do two things. First, it's designed to provide justice and restitution to victims. The $1.34 billion verdict is meant to be collected and distributed to victims. Second, it's designed to deter future fraud. When potential criminals see that real estate fraud results in federal prison, massive fines, and verdicts in the billions, they think twice. But the system only works if fraud is reported, if cases are investigated, and if perpetrators are held accountable. In 2026, that's happening more than ever before. But it only happens because victims speak up, because whistleblowers come forward, because forensic investigators follow the money. So here's my question for you. Have you ever been approached with a too-good-to-be-true real estate investment opportunity? Have you ever suspected fraud in a property transaction? The comments section below is where this conversation continues. Real stories from real people who've encountered real estate fraud. That's what helps others avoid becoming victims themselves. If you're interested in how courts handle financial crime, how forensic accountants crack these cases wide open, or how the legal system is adapting to combat fraud in 2026, subscribe to The Verdict Room. We break down the cases, we explain the law, and we show you why justice, when it finally arrives, matters. The Verdict Room, where the law comes alive. Stay curious, stay vigilant, and never stop asking questions about where your money is really going.